Let me just start by saying I'm Manisha Sinha, and I teach at the University of Connecticut. And I'm happy to be here to talk about the history of abolition in the US and in Connecticut in particular, and to relate it to the films that you're going to be seeing, because you will see how the enslaved resisted their conditions through several ways, and music and song was one of the most important ways, and remains one of the most important contributions of people of African descent to the United States and the world. But in my talk today, I just want to emphasize this issue of slave resistance, and how slave resistance must be seen as essential to the history of abolition. And a lot of it comes from my book, The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition. What I argue in the book is not just that African Americans or Black abolitionists played a central part in the movement, but that the enslaved did. That slave resistance, rather than bourgeois liberalism, is central to understanding the history of abolition. And once we get that basic, simple point, we will be able to understand John Brown much better. Because for many Americans, John Brown just comes out of nowhere and they're like, oh, like he's this crazy radical abolitionist. But actually, John Brown comes very much from the traditions of the abolition movement. You can see that this is true of Connecticut. We often forget that Connecticut, of course, was a slave state, especially in the colonial era, before it got rid of slavery very gradually through gradual emancipation laws. One can see colonial slave runaway advertisements from the Hartford Courant. You could just simply go and get copies of these runaway slave advertisements showing that New England and Connecticut in particular were very much involved in the history of slavery and slave trade in that time. Now, of course, the revolution does make a difference. The northern states, starting with Vermont and ending with New Jersey, start getting rid of slavery, either through judicial proclamations, but mostly through gradual emancipation laws, which freed children of enslaved rather than enslaved themselves. And this is my argument, that these people, like Venture Smith, were the original abolitionists. Enslaved people resisting their own enslavement were the original abolitionists. They wrote narratives that not only detailed their own experiences, but also highlighted the cruelties of slavery and the arbitrary nature of slavery. And there are other interesting figures who wrote their narratives and came out of slavery in Connecticut. One of them was James Mars, who actually published his narrative only during the Civil War. But Mars is interesting. He belonged to a very important Black abolitionist church in Hartford, and he also belonged to the executive committee of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. He was a fugitive slave himself who ran away from his Virginian enslavers and was hidden, or rather ran away from his enslaver in Connecticut, who wanted to take him to Virginia after Connecticut abolishes slavery. And he was hidden by many friends, including white anti-slavery people in Connecticut. We should know that Connecticut had one of the earlier abolition societies, the Connecticut Society for the Promotion of Freedom and the Relief of Persons Unlawfully Held in Bondage, and they helped implement Connecticut's gradual emancipation laws, preventing people like Mars from being sold down south. We've heard of the Solomon Northup story from the 19th century. Now it's a big movie, but this happened all the time. And this, of course, happened in the 18th century in Connecticut, when it was a slave state, gradually getting rid of slavery. And that process doesn't really get completed in Connecticut right down to 1848, even though the law is passed in 1784. So Connecticut kind of goes backwards. In its 1818 state constitution, it pretty much disfranchises all Black men. Even before that, the Connecticut state legislature had actually disfranchised Black men. So here is an example of a state the only one in New England, by the way, that disfranchised Black men, that actually gave Black men the right to vote, and then took it away. And that becomes the kind of model for many other northern states who take away the right to vote from Black men who, if they could meet property holding qualifications, could actually vote in the early republic. But on the eve of the Civil War, only Blacks could only vote in the New England states, except for Connecticut. Um, Now, of course, African Americans protested against these conditions. They protested against second class citizenship at one of the most important churches, the Fifth Congregational Church, also known as the Talcott Street Church, because it was at that time located in Talcott Street. It's still alive, that church and congregation. Many of its pastors protested against the increasing rise of racism, the disfranchisement of Black men, and the spread of Southern slavery. I mean, slavery was not dying out, it was spreading, and African Americans were leading the charge against both slavery and the disfranchisement of Black people. Now, of course, you have heard of the Amistad Rebellion and how that rebellion begun by mainly Africans in 1839 in the internal slave trade of Cuba. Eventually, this slaver is steered to Long Island, and the case is tried in Connecticut. And this really galvanizes Black and white abolitionists in Connecticut. But it introduces in the 1830s and 1840s these slave rebellions, beginning with Nat Turner's rebellion, but also the Amistad shipboard rebellions like Amistad and the Creole, which came a little later than the Amistad, make abolitionists defend the right of the enslaved to rebel. Now, this is important because a lot of these abolitionists are pacifists. The evangelicals, the Garrisonians, they're all pacifists. They do not believe in violence. But when it comes to slave resistance, they defend it. And of course, we know John Brown himself was involved with this in Springfield, where he formed an all-Black militia called the League of Gileadites, in which he tried to oppose the implementation of the fugitive slave law in Springfield, Massachusetts. And this became quite common in the 1850s when you have fugitive slave rebellions all over the country, all over the North. So again, showing you that when we look at John Brown ultimately and his war against slavery, it very much comes from this long history of abolition, this long history of centering African Americans within abolition. He's inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which is the first and only instance of a successful slave rebellion in world history. He's inspired by the slave conspiracies and revolts that are taking place by the Jamaican Maroons, who are fighting against the colonial administration in Jamaica. So his war against slavery, it comes out of these traditions from abolition. He's not some crazy person. He had his own family. I mean, his grandfather was a Revolutionary War soldier. So he knows, he connects this rather with the fight for liberty, for Black liberty, with this older revolutionary tradition. And he is very much involved in the abolition movement. He's not a lone wolf, as he is commonly portrayed. He's funded by some abolitionists. He gives speeches to Black and white abolitionists. A lot of Black abolitionists, including Pennington, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, meet with him. So he's not some sort of outlier, which is the way we normally see him. I make a extensive case for this in my book. I'm going to end with this slide because this is a statue of John Brown from his last home in North Elba, New York. And I like it because a lot of activists associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and this is even before the murder of George Floyd. This is when the Black Lives Matter movement started, with the murder of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, a whole lot of other Black men and women, unarmed Black men and women, many of them, and that they saw themselves as continuing the legacy of John Brown, which I find really interesting, right? That this abolitionist struggle for Black equality and Black, rights is not something that sort of dies with the abolition movement or dies with John Brown's execution. He's widely viewed as a martyr in his times. His words seem timeless. That many present day activists should call themselves modern day abolitionists.